uploaded it to the group. All right, it is recording. So we are doing the sharpening the blade, and John Risvold is going to talk about maximizing your TBI cases. So, John, take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, like Tyson said, I'm John Risvold. I'm a trial lawyer in Chicago. I practice all over the state, really, but primarily in Chicago and surrounding suburbs. And more, I'd say over the last 3 years or so, my practice has really started to become a lot more TBI heavy. We're handling a lot more traumatic brain injury work. And as we've done more of that work, I've had the opportunity to learn a lot of the medicine and learn a lot of really cool techniques, I think, that'll help you maximize these cases, both pre-suit and if you were to try them. It all sort of started for me. I went out to a conference put on by the Brain Injury Association of California called TBI Med Legal, which is a 3-day conference where they're just bringing in hundreds of lawyers and doctors, medical professionals, experts, to talk about all the science and all the litigation techniques and everything else associated with how to really handle everything from, a minor concussion, mild TBI, all the way up to your, serious traumatic brain injury cases like, or subdural, even as far as a subdural hematoma type case. So it's been really interesting, really fun. So in terms of maximizing the value of your case, I mean, at least for me, it begins the minute the client comes through the door. A lot of times you're going to meet brain injured clients who, at least in my experience, don't realize that they have necessarily a brain injury. Now, that's not the case for very serious brain injuries where it's evident, but the hardest part about mild traumatic brain injury, which is what most of these cases tend to be, a concussion with post-concussive syndrome is a mild traumatic brain injury. So an MTBI, I think these are the hardest cases to handle. And it really begins from the get-go with initial assessments and getting to know who your client is. I know you and I have talked in the past a lot about getting to know your clients and knowing them as human beings. And I know that there's a large movement among trial lawyers to do more of that. The nice thing is I'm not a volume practice. I don't have thousands of cases. So I have the opportunity to get to know my clients. So what I like to do is start with some initial assessments of what their injuries are. Usually it's a conversation like any other intake, but I like to do it face to face. You can tell oftentimes when people are suffering the symptoms of a traumatic brain injury when you're looking at them. They have difficulty concentrating. They have difficulty word finding, memory issues, sometimes aversion to light or sound, dizziness. Those sorts of symptoms can be sort of self-evident. And then I also like to talk to their spouse, significant other, friend, family member, before I start going out into the periphery of coworkers and, family friends or close friends or anything else. And I can talk about those and why they're important. But right from the get-go, I use a couple different assessments, and I'm going to share one of them real quick if you don't mind.
No, go, take it away.
Cool. I'm just off to the races today.
I like it.
All right. It says I have to ask your permission.
And I'll give you the permission.
I appreciate it.
Go for it.
All right, cool. So I know Guy talked about this the other day. And he was talking about assessments, and I know he showed the Philadelphia brain injury assessment. Is that right?
Right.
And that's a great one. These are, again, from BICAL. And it starts these are what they use sort of at least what I've seen in a clinical setting, but they work really well for lawyers. And I'm happy to share these with everybody. They were shared with me, and, I don't know who said it, but right, great artists borrow, or good artists borrow, great artists steal. So I just try to work these into a conversation with the client. Are you having any difficulty with memory? Tell me about the 10 to 30 seconds after the crash, after the fall, when you hit your head. What did it feel like? Or in a car crash case, it's often they're not hitting their head. It's associated with the whiplash, the coup contra coup of the brain bouncing in the skull, causing the brain injury. Are you having difficulty concentrating? Are you having difficulty paying attention to what I'm saying right now? Walking through all these symptoms can give you a really good idea of what they're experiencing. And this is a 6-page assessment. It really goes in depth. I wouldn't necessarily worry about checking all of these boxes. These are prior diagnoses that are sort of unrelated, but they can sort of overlap. You want to know about past history. If you've had a brain injury, you are twice as likely to have a future brain injury. So people that have a history of concussions, for instance, I had 2 concussions playing high school football. I'm more susceptible to a future concussion. You want to know that because if you're in Illinois like me, or in Missouri, I think Missouri's an eggshell plaintiff state too, you get great jury instructions. Pre-existing conditions are not a defense. I think it's hysterical when adjusters try to make that a defense, because all they're doing is giving us a really powerful jury instruction. So you want to know about those sorts of things right off the bat too. And the important thing, at least with this assessment, is you can give it to them to take home and to do, and give them as much time as they need. It's really hard when you put a client on the spot, especially if they've got a mild traumatic brain injury. They're going to have trouble with the processing of some of these things. And the other one that I use, it's a little more, I think it's a little simpler. It's in-house for me. It's just a point scale. Did you look at the ER bill? Did you see mention of a concussion? 5 points. Did they hit their head? They have gaps in memory, persistent headaches, forgetful, anxious, so on and so forth. These initial assessments, I think, are really good to sort of get you an idea of not necessarily how serious a brain injury is, because that's going to be a diagnosis. That's going to be a determination for your experts. And that's a huge component of maximizing the value of these cases. And I can talk about that too. But this gives you an idea of how difficult or easy, and none of it's easy, but how difficult or easy it's going to be to prove that your client has a concussion or has a traumatic brain injury, because they're invisible injuries. So beyond just initial intake, I think it's important to follow up with a TBI client in the same way a doctor would schedule a follow-up, right?
Hey, John, really quick, will you explain that? So you get this point system.
Yeah.
And what do you do? And maybe you're about to get to this, but what do you do once they're over 5 points?
When they're over 5 points, what I'm wanting to do is follow up with them on a regular basis to learn whether or not they're improving or whether or not this is a permanent injury. A lot of times, more and more, I'm seeing there are long-lasting effects of mild traumatic brain injury well into the future, whether it be complete changes in personality. I mean, I just resolved a case with a client who had a traumatic brain injury, and I knew him. He was a family friend. I've known him for a long time. He's a different person now. He's an angry, bitter, upset, easily agitated person. And his neurologist says, and we'll talk about the experts too, and I don't want to rely too heavily on the neurologist alone, but the neurologist says, yeah, that's part of an axonal injury. He's got a diffuse axonal injury. He's got shearing of the axons, or stretching and tearing of the axons, which is a pretty common type of brain injury associated with a car crash, mild traumatic brain injury. And he's going to have this personality change for possibly forever. So when you get to a certain point threshold, you know that this is not a concussion that resolves within a couple weeks, or a concussion that resolves within 8 to 12 weeks, or something like that. It's somebody, and this is why I've got it highlighted to flag for review, right? Flag for review every 90 days. I probably should do it sooner than that, like every 45. But every 3 months or so, I want to check in and see, how are you doing? Are you still treating? What is your treatment? How are you feeling? And then sort of run through the same initial checklist that I see down here about, do you still have issues sleeping? Are you having any anxiety, depression, feelings like that? These cases are not cases you want to rush to the courthouse. They're cases that really take time, and sometimes a lot of money to develop them out. And the money thing is sort of whether or not you go full bore with experts, or whether or not you're able to use some of the treaters as your de facto experts. It really depends on the quality of the treater. More and more here in Chicago, we're finding that because all the doctors are insured by the same insurance company, and that insurance company hates lawyers like us, that they're not really interested in helping us much anymore, and we're having to hire a lot of experts even on smaller cases. But that's what I tend to do with the initial intake. And then beyond that, these checklists, and I'll spread them far and wide, these checklists, again, can be used, stop this. They really can be used for the lay witnesses. So in every TBI case, when I do an initial intake, and I'm initially talking to the client, I want them to list anyone that they normally interact with. Who's your boss? Give me the names of 2 close friends. Give me the names of 2 close coworkers. Let me talk to your spouse. And I want them to give me the name, the address if they know it, but a contact, an email or a phone number. And I want to reach out to these people independently. I think, when you're trying to prove an invisible injury like a TBI, the most important thing you need to be able to show is who was this person, and who are they now, and who are they going to be in the future. You see a lot of huge TBI verdicts, and what you're seeing is a jury that's adopted a life care plan or adopted future medical or future damages because the lawyer has been able to prove that this is a permanent injury by showing the before, middle, and after. So the lay witnesses are vitally important, and you want to talk to as many of them as you can. Now, when it comes to a trial, and I was just going through this before, we were talking about this before, how I'm losing every trial date due to the pandemic, but I had a TBI trial supposed to go in July, and we've got 25 lay witnesses that we've identified. And so what I'm doing is I'm calling them and having Zoom conversations and saying, tell me about Patty. Tell me about what she was like before the crash. What was her personality like? Who was she as a person? And then, as terrible as this might sound, I'm ranking them A, B, C, D, E, F. Well, not E, A, B, C, D, F. And just striking them off the list and circling the ones I want and figuring out, all right, is this a person I want to stick in the middle of my trial? Is this somebody who could lead off for me? I'm a big baseball guy. I think of it, you got to think of your lineup at trial the same way I think you would think of a baseball lineup, right? You want to have some meat in the center, but you don't want to lose at the end. You want to finish with sort of a pop, which is why you're not seeing as many pitchers bat ninth, right? And I think a TBI trial works generally the same way. You're going to want to figure out who can show this invisible injury. Now, they're not always invisible injuries. And I think that the scans are really, really important. And there's a lot of them we could talk about. I kind of want to just go over the big ones and kind of tell you, at least in my opinion, what I think you should look for, or at least try if you can. Some of these are harder to find or harder to get into. I know Guy was talking about DTI the other day, and it's, a 3T DTI MRI is not a super common MRI machine. It's not in every hospital. It's not everywhere. You need
also super expensive too.
Very true. Typically, the workup starts at the ER with a lot of these cases, and ERs are not designed to diagnose and treat traumatic brain injuries. And just let me, not to offend any ER doctors or one of my best friends is an ER doctor, not to defend them. That's not their job. Their job is to triage and then get you to a primary care provider and make sure that you're stable. They're not there to diagnose and treat. If you get any good information from the ER record, awesome. You get, headaches, nausea, dizziness, concussion, diagnosis, everything. That's great. If you don't, it is not fatal. A lot of defense lawyers love to look at ER records, or at least in my experience, look at ER records and say, oh, your client had a Glasgow Coma scale of 15 out of 15. So that's normal. You can have a 15 out of 15 Glasgow Coma scale and still have a mild traumatic brain injury. You can have a 13 and still have a mild traumatic brain injury. It doesn't necessarily mean anything as it pertains to whether or not you have a mild traumatic brain injury. It can be a useful tool in determining how serious your brain injury may be, but it's not determinative. But they're going to take a CT scan right off the bat, usually at the hospital, brain CT. That's also not going to show you much in terms of a mild TBI. It's going to show you whether there's, bleeding on the brain, or whether there's anything that's very serious that the ER needs to triage. But other than that, they're not really going to be able to use that. You're not going to be able to use that, generally speaking, for anything of value. The MRI, same sort of deal. A neurologist is usually going to prescribe an MRI. So for those that don't know, the sort of general course of treatment that I've seen for, say, a car crash, mild TBI, is the client goes into the ER by ambulance. They're given a CT of the brain. They're diagnosed with a concussion, discharged. Follow up with a primary refers them to a neurologist. Neurologist orders an MRI, and then they do perhaps some sort of therapy, whether it be, some sort of vocational rehab, vestibular therapy, something like that. Sometimes the neurologist will refer out to a neuropsychologist for testing to give you an indication of whether or not they have functional limitations. That's rare. That's a really good neurologist. If you get a neurologist that's referring out to a neuropsych, that's awesome. But that's more rare. And that's kind of about it. There's not really a ton of treatment beyond that. There are some effective treatments to alleviate some of the symptoms. Physical therapy and chiropractic can be very useful to eliminate some of the headaches or eliminate some of the nausea and dizziness. I know that's been very effective for my clients. It's been effective for me in the past when I've had concussion symptoms. But that's usually how it goes. So when you get to the neurologist and they take an MRI, the MRI is just showing, again, the structure just in more detail. The way I've had it explained to me by neurologists is, if you're looking for an axonal injury, which is, for those of you that don't know the medicine, your brain is made up of axons and neurons and dendrites, and the axons, are essentially cables that send signals between the neurons of your brain. And the axons will get stretched, they'll pull, get stretched or torn, and that is what causes a lot of the symptoms of a brain injury and the sort of side effects of a brain injury, are these sort of diffuse axonal injuries. And they're not going to show up necessarily on an MRI. It would be like taking a Polaroid picture of your home and then trying to sell it on Zillow. It's not really going to show up. Like, you could see the Polaroid, your house looks pretty, but no one's going to understand it if they see it. And the same goes for a jury. First, they don't know what the hell they're looking at when they see an MRI film, but also they don't know what to look for. So what I always push, if possible, because we talked about the 3T DTI, and I'll get to that, and spec scans and everything else. I like a functional MRI. Functional MRI tends to be a little more common, and what a functional MRI is, it's essentially the same concept of taking constant pictures of your brain in slices, but it's done at a metabolic scale. So what you're seeing is either the brain at rest, a functional resting MRI, or the brain doing a task. So they'll be asking your client, put the square peg in the square hole, put the round peg in the round hole, and they're doing the task, and the MRI is scanning the brain, and it's showing you what areas of the brain are lighting up and what aren't. Nice thing about that is you can slap it up onto a board or onto a PowerPoint and show it to a jury and say, this is what it's supposed to look like on the left when Joe Smith is putting the pegs in the holes. And you see this big white spot here, this is the part of his brain that's not working when he can't figure out where to put the peg and why he can't figure out what hole to put it in. So I really like a functional MRI for that sort of reason. The DTI, the 3T DTI, it's a nuclear scan. So the nuclear scans are going to give you a much clearer picture of where in the brain particularly the dysfunction is, whether it's the occipital lobe, so you're having problems with your vision, or whether it's a frontal lobe issue, so you're having language issue problems, things like that. It's going to give you a really, really cool, clear picture of what it is. And I thought that I had a DTI scan that I could show everybody. I don't have one handy because I'm working remotely, and that's the world I live in. I apologize. But I'll share some images of them with you, and you can spread them far and wide to everybody afterwards. I'll put together a little packet for everybody.
Hey, before you do that, before we go any further, you were talking about using things in trial. I saw something really freaking cool on one of the case analysis presentations last week, where they basically light up the imaging. Do you hire any companies to do anything like that for you?
We haven't, and honestly, that was the first time I've seen that done. I saw it with the MRI of the spine, the Matt Morgan presentation, and that's incredibly cool. The pictures he was using in that presentation of the brain are what DTI scans look like. That's just what they look like without having to even really do anything to them. So they're that useful, and they're that informative, where you can really, with a pointer or with your finger, point the jury exactly to, this is objective evidence of a traumatic brain injury. And as you're trying to prove these cases, so much of them are subjective. And what you want to try to find as much as possible is objective evidence of a brain injury. And it has to be more than the client saying, I have these issues and I have these problems. And it has to be more than a lay witness saying, I have these issues and I have these problems. So the two things I really, really like are either the Spec Scan, which again is just another scan that I think is really good. It's a single photon emission computerized tomography. And what it really is it's another nuclear imaging test, and it gives you a functionality, sort of a view of the functionality of the brain. I think, if you've seen any of those images of the brain from, I see them a lot from, as it relates to maybe veterans, and you see a pre-war, post-war brain scan. Sometimes those are SPEC scans, and they show in color areas of the brain that are lit up. Those are incredibly useful. Now, to put everybody on notice, functional MRIs, 3T DTI, SPEC scans, very, very expensive. SPEC scans, at least as far as I know, I've never tried to get one into evidence, are difficult to get into evidence because it is an emerging technology.
When you say, John, when you say very, very expensive, can you give any sense of ballpark, or how hard is it to get it covered by insurance? Is that almost impossible?
I don't know that it's almost impossible. That really depends on how good the insurance is. I've had them. The last one that I had was done on a lien, and it was $12,000. So your regular MRI these days is like $1,500 on the high end.
And I've not been able to find anybody to do it on a lien. We've only been able to do it on a paying up front. I'm going to show you a picture of a DTI scan.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
I know you were talking about that before. I had to look really quick and find one. So give me a second. I had to make sure we didn't have any client sensitive information.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to show you just a small snippet because I don't want to reveal any client information. So can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So this gives you the contents and then some of the scans.
So you can see, what they're boxing there, the white spots and the dark spots, those are areas of the brain that are damaged. And the DTI, the 3T DTI, is so detailed that it is able to pick these up. Now, the way it's been explained to me is that a CT scan is going to show you like 5% of what you need to see. An MRI is going to show you 20%. The DTI is going to show you 60%. And the SPEC scan is going to show you 80%, possibly more. So they can be very, very cool. Let me see if I can even just pick an image off of Google to show you what the SPEC scan is going to show. Yeah, these are what they look like. Let me go full screen on that.
You'll be able to light those up would be just so powerful.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. This is for an Alzheimer's patient, but bear with me. This is what they tend to look like here. So you can see the brain in 3D. This is what a brain with depression looks like from, different angles. This is what dementia or Alzheimer's are doing to the brain. This is what the SPEC scan is going to show you. So you can actually show the jury portions of the brain in 3D that have been damaged. I think it's very, very effective. The other really important objective evidence that I really like is neuropsych testing. It can cut both ways and it can be very dangerous, but when you're talking about experts in cases like this, I think, it is my belief that you need two important experts. You can have a stable of many, many experts. You could go get life care planners. You can get functional assessment experts. You can get anything under the sun, really. But what you need as a baseline, in my opinion, is a really good neurologist who can explain the medicine in a way that doesn't make you feel dumb. Because this is not easy medicine. It's emerging medicine. It gets different and better every day. And I can talk about why that's important here in a second. But you need a neurologist. You also need a neuropsychologist, in my opinion, whether it be a treater or an expert. I don't care if it's either. If it's a treater, it's even better because you didn't pay for them and they don't really have a dog in the fight. But the defense is going to hire a neuropsychologist, and that neuropsych is going to take independent neuropsych exams of your client. And you're going to have to fight like hell to make sure that they're videoed or audio recorded, that you're allowed to be present, because they're supposed to be controlled exams. So you're not necessarily supposed to film them. You're not supposed to be present. They're not supposed to be witnessed by anyone but the doctor. But as with every defense exam, they're suspect, and I would be very cautious and careful to just accept them. I would never accept them at face value, but accept them without a recording or without an audio recording. I think that's really, really important. And again, really a lot of this is proving the long-term injury. So the other expert I recommend, if you have a catastrophic injury, if you're able to show that there is a serious lifelong injury, if your neurologist and your neuropsychologist are saying it's a serious lifelong injury, it's going to get worse over time, it's not going to get better, consider a life care planner. And consider, okay, this person's 35 right now and they've got a traumatic brain injury. When will they need care in their life? Most of us are going to need care in our lives when we're in our 80s or 90s, right? Just more likely than not, we will. More likely than not, a person with a traumatic brain injury is going to need that care much, much sooner. It's going to be much more expensive. So a lot of the time you can plan for that simply by discussing it with a life care planner. The important thing with all these cases is, at least in my mind, at least getting them maximized, is a couple things. You have to help the defense lawyer with these cases. And what I mean by that is that they're invisible injuries. The defense lawyers have 400 or 500 files at a time. And I know because I used to be one. They've got 400 or 500 files at a time. They don't know your client from Adam, and they don't believe your client is seriously injured, no matter how injured he is or she is. So what you need to do is to be able to show them objectively, this is an injury, this is an outcome. This is an injury, this is an outcome, this is, so on and so, connect the dots for them. That way, when you get into a situation like a mediation towards trial, the defense lawyer is going to be able to explain to the adjuster for you some of the things that they wouldn't otherwise understand. It took me a while, and I think it was beneficial that I did defense work, but it took me a while to realize that the defense lawyer is not my enemy. The insurance company is certainly my enemy. And I'm certainly going to war against them. But the defense lawyer is a guy or gal who has a mortgage and has a family and is working a job, and they can help you, and they can help your clients, and they can help you maximize cases simply by you not being an asshole, which is hard for me because I'm a very aggressive, like type A person, but also teaching them what the case is about and what the medicine is and everything else. Truly, the way you maximize these cases is show before and after. You can tell a story about who your client was, who they were going to be but for this crash, and that was taken from them. Our brains are supercomputers for our bodies. And if my computer's on the fritz here, I'm working on my Mac, my computer's on the fritz, I run a diagnostic check. We can't run a diagnostic check on ourselves. So our clients need us. They need a neuropsych, they need a neurologist to run that diagnostic check for us to figure out what's wrong, and then to show to a jury or show to a judge or a mediator or defense counsel, this is the impact of that. These are really non-economic damages cases. You're not going to have huge bills generally. You're not going to have huge specials. You might have huge lost wage, truly, but by and large, they're non-economic. So it's a lot of proving future and proving the non-economic damages. So I know I rambled for like a half an hour, but that's about the gist of it in my mind. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. If anybody has them, they want to put them in chat or they want to send me an email, you can email me. My email is jrisvold at collinslaw.com. And you can find me on Facebook. I'm pretty active in the group. Anything else? So thanks a lot.
Excellent. Well, I want to keep these things like just short and concise. So I'm going to wrap it up just because I just want to make sure that people know that whenever we're done, we're done.
Right.
So, dude, this has been great. So I'll upload this so that people can continue that conversation because I think this is really excellent stuff, especially for new people, newbies. Guy, before I do this, before I wrap things up, anything you want to add or ask or anything? And Guy, I know that you're on mute on your phone, so you may not be able to unmute it. I'm not sure, but I'll give you 3, 2, 1. Okay, no. All right, good. John, thanks so much, man. It's really good. I'll upload it right now, and thanks, dude. Appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.
Good work. You too. See ya.
Yep.